everybody, and welcome back to another video. Now this video is going to be probably one of the most important videos that I have uploaded, one of the most important ones, and it's regarding the efficacy of the Susan Shore tinnitus device. Sorry about this guys, but for about the first 5 minutes of the video I left my Discord notifications on, so you're going to hear some beeps. First and foremost, is Susan Shore's device a cure? No, it is not. It is not a cure, and I need to make this very clear. The Susan Shore's tinnitus device is a treatment. Does it have the potential to induce full suppression? Yes, it does. Will this full suppression stay forever? That depends. A lot of the people, including Guinea Boy, who participated in these trials that were, by the way, these trials were not organized by me. They were organized by another significant member of our community. And I thought that this was very understandable, but apparently not clear enough. These individuals who built and used their Susan Shore device, some of them did see some suppression, and some of them did reach silence. Is the suppression consistent? From what I have heard, yes, it is. Does their tinnitus sometimes come back? Yes, it does. And I need to make this very, very extremely clear that what you do before, during, and after the Susan Shore device treatment can potentially cause the tinnitus to come back. Does this mean you have to use the Susan Shore's device forever? Probably not, but that depends exactly on your protocol and what you do while and after and before you use it. Now, if anybody has any sort of tension or any sort of issues with their temporomandibular joint, which is the trigeminal nerve, or any cervical tension, which is the C1 to C3 right here, you can see that the trigeminal cervical nucleus is where all of these things connect together. And as we all know, the trigeminal cervical nucleus, or the SP5, as you can see right here, is extremely important as it directly inputs information into the dorsal cochlear nucleus, which is what the Susan Shore device stimulates. Now, I've already mentioned this in my previous videos, but we had some people, one person in particular, Guinea Boy, who did not improve until he addressed his cervical and jaw tension. I will explain why in a minute here, for those who want the deep scientific explanation. But we've actually recently had another person, and me and Guinea Boy, mostly Guinea Boy actually, he was the one who was experimenting on himself. And I've already, said that this is a very, very significant thing that he has done for the community. And again, a huge thanks to him. Me and Guinea Boy were basically, discussing this and researching this, and he was doing all the tests on himself. And until he treated his very severe cervical and jaw tension, mostly jaw actually, he did not see any improvement from the device usage. And coincidentally, there was another person who was actually separately studying all of this and experimenting on himself, and we'll call him Jaw Boy. So Jaw Boy basically had severe clenching, severe bruxism, which is, by the way, a side effect of being anxious. So I think all of you can actually make conclusions based on that. For those of you who don't get the drift, anxiety causes the person to clench in their sleep and also in their waking hours. This also applies to people who chew their nails, who chew a lot of gum. You're putting a lot of stress on your temporomandibular joint, or your jaw, basically, where, as you can see right here, the V2 and mostly V3, actually, branch of the trigeminal nerve originates. Now, in any case, this person, absolutely separately from me and Guinea Boy, Jaw Boy, he managed to discover this on his own. So he was not able to get the pins and needles feeling, or the pins and needle stimulation of the buccal nerve, which is the sensory nerve located right here, or the greater auricular nerve or the lesser occipital nerve, which is located, it's not actually shown here, but its branches actually input into the sensory roots of the cervical nerves. In any case, he independently discovered that he was not getting the correct tingling stimulation that he needed because of his jaw tension, because of his bruxism. And he started addressing it ASAP. And as soon as he did, not right as soon as he did, but when he did start addressing it, eventually he managed to start seeing some suppression. Not full suppression, just some suppression. And if anybody is curious, Guinea Boy does actually have problems with bruxism and clenching. And his tinnitus actually does return sometimes after sleep. And a lot of people don't know this, but when you are sleeping, your jaw is basically opened up, a lot of the time. And because of that, and also because of the bruxism or the clenching in your sleep, actually causes a lot of tension on the temporomandibular joint and a lot of tension on the trigeminal nerve. So even Guinea Boy, who did see full suppression and did have full suppression or silence, does have his tinnitus come back sometimes. But currently, he's working on it right now. So he's working on his jaw tension, and he's working on his bruxism. And there's one thing that does help some people with this jaw opening during sleep thing, is one of those straps you can get onto your face that basically closes your jaw for when you sleep. They're usually sold for sleep apnea, which is snoring. And people who have sleep apnea should actually pay even more attention to this, because sleep apnea does have an indirect effect also on the tension in your temporomandibular joint area. Now, for any of you who are wondering what should be done about this, it's actually not very simple. So a lot of people think that you can go to a chiropractor or an osteopath, but very often these people do not know what they are doing, and they are quacks, and they can actually mess you up a lot. You absolutely must go to a competent TMJD, temporomandibular joint dysfunction, or cervical physical therapist. And it's very, very important that you understand that just pressing trigger points or anything like that, or massages, is not enough. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this, like wearing something like a strap for your posture if you have severe postural issues, addressing your anxiety for the bruxism, taking care of your sleep apnea, of your jaw, like being mindful of your clenching. Tongue posture is actually something that people don't think about a lot. And a physical therapist, as I've mentioned before, a competent professional physical therapist is not going to just massage you and say, we're done. Yeah? There's a lot of things that go into adequately treating chronic cervical and jaw tension. And it's very important for you to know that even though your neck doesn't crack or even though your jaw doesn't pop, this does not mean that you do not have this tension. So I know that this might be a little bit counterintuitive, but people absolutely should visit a PT who will look at your MRI, if you can do one, different types of scans, anything like that. If you show up to somebody and they just massage you and tell you that you're done, you know that you chose the wrong specialist. For example, laser therapy has shown to help people immensely. Dry needling has shown also to help people immensely with their tension issues. So you can understand that it's more than just massaging and you're good to go. I repeat, do not do any of this at home. Visit a competent and experienced physical therapist who is a specialist in jaw or cervical tension or both, and do what they recommend you to do. You should not attempt to do any of this at home unless it is a very safe and very commonly known maybe stretch or exercise. Consult with a PT, basically. Now let's get into the deep scientific stuff for those who are into this. Now, for those who just arrived, it's going to be really hard for you to catch up, but I'm going to give a brief rundown. Susan Shore's device relies on precisely timed stimulation of auditory and somatosensory inputs to induce spike timing-dependent plasticity, which is the decrease of synaptic strength or communication between the neurons within the dorsal cochlear nucleus. And this neural plasticity mechanism helps recalibrate abnormal hyperactivity, or also known as maladaptive plasticity, in fusiform cells, as you can see right here. Now, these are principal neurons within the dorsal cochlear nucleus, which are implicated in tinnitus, as per Susan Shore's research and others as well. Now, by pairing the sound cues with the somatosensory stimulation at very carefully controlled intervals, will lead the device to encouraging long-term synaptic depression, which means making the connections between the neurons weaker. Long-term depression reduces the excessive firing patterns that correlate with tinnitus. However, if the person's somatosensory system is chronically disturbed by conditions like temporomandibular joint disorder, bruxism, dental overbite, cervical or neck muscle tension, these abnormalities can continuously feed pathological input signals into the DCN. Now, for those who don't know, the DCN does not only process auditory signals, it also integrates inputs from the spinal trigeminal nucleus, or SP5, as it is indicated right here on this diagram from Susan Shore's paper. Now, the SP5 is a center that receives tactile, proprioceptive, and nociceptive information from the face, jaw, and the neck. And this neural circuitry in the DCN's multimodal. It means that it integrates both sound, auditory nerve fiber inputs, as you can see here, and body-related signals, as you can see over here, the SP5 and the other related somatosensory pathways. And these additional signals arrive via the granule cells, as you can see right here, which project to the interneurons, which are neurons responsible for communication, and principal cells like the fusiform cells, and also inhibitory interneurons, which are called cartwheel cells, as you can see right here. Now, let's dive even deeper into what all of this means. Let's start by taking a look at this diagram right here. Now, the cochlear nucleus, which is also known as just CN, is the first central auditory relay station in the brainstem. The dorsal cochlear nucleus, which is what we're looking at right now, is a part of the cochlear nucleus. It integrates both the auditory and the somatosensory information. Now, the fusiform cells, which are the ones right here. Now, these are principal neurons in the dorsal cochlear nucleus that can become hyperactive in tinnitus, and they do most often. They receive excitatory input from the auditory nerve fibers, as you can see right here, via the VGLUT1 plus terminals. I'm not going to dive into what this is, just remember it as VGLUT1. And it also receives modulatory input from granule cell parallel fibers, which are these long axons right here. These are also called the VGLUT2 terminals, which convey the somatosensory information. Now, the cartwheel cells, who are the major players in this whole ordeal, they are inhibitory interneurons in the dorsal cochlear nucleus that receive multimodal inputs from the granule cells, and their activity, these ones right here, the cartwheel cells, shapes and refines the firing of fusiform cells, which contributes to the, I guess you could say, neural game control, as much as I hate that word. Now, the spinal trigeminal nucleus, which is also known as SP5, is a brainstem nucleus that receives somatosensory signals from the face, jaw, also from the neck as well, and related structures. Now, a dysfunctional jaw or a dysfunctional jaw alignment, temporomandibular joint dysfunction, or teeth grinding can actually increase abnormal somatosensory input into the DCN from these SB5 projections. So that basically means, as I mentioned before, that if you have any issues like this, you are basically potentially increasing or reinforcing these feedback loops. Now again, about the granule cells and the parallel fibers. These carry the somatosensory signals like those from the SP5 or the dorsal column nuclei or the, pontine nuclei, it doesn't matter. They carry these somatosensory signals to the fusiform cells and the cartwheel cells. And when these parallel fibers or the granule cells express abnormal firing patterns or too many action potentials, this actually maintains the maladaptive plasticity as well. Not only just more noise, coming in from the auditory nerve fiber. It's very important that you all understand that abnormal somatosensory input, also actually combined with abnormal input from the auditory nerve fiber, can actually maintain the hyperactive state, also known as feedback loops or maladaptive plasticity. Well, I guess chronic maladaptive plasticity, I guess you could also say that. Now, as to why the untreated somatosensory issues can reduce the device's efficacy. Now, as I mentioned before in TMJD, bruxism, overbite, cervical tension, blah, 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 if all of that is not addressed, these conditions can keep sending irregular, heightened somatosensory signals into the dorsal cochlear nucleus. And this persistent, noisy input competes with the carefully timed stimulations provided by the device. And instead of allowing the DCN's synapses to settle into a more normalized, less excitable state, the ongoing somatosensory dysfunction continually re-triggers or re-establishes maladaptive neural patterns, or these feedback loops that I mentioned. This literally prevents the stable induction of long-term synaptic depression, and therefore negates the beneficial effects of the device. In other words, the device tries to teach the neurons to be less active, but the untreated somatosensory problems keep reteaching them the opposite lesson, making the overall therapy far less effective. Another thing people have been asking me is why somatic maneuvers affect tinnitus pitch and volume. Now, these somatic maneuvers, such as bending the neck or flexing the jaw, they actually directly alter the signals traveling through the somatosensory pathways connected to the DCN. And by changing muscle tension or jaw alignment, these maneuvers modify the input from the trigeminal and the cervical nerve endings that feed into the DCN's multimodal circuitry. And as a result, the altered somatosensory input can transiently shift the balance of excitatory and inhibitory modulation on fusiform cells, ergo the cartwheel cells. Depending on whether the shift leads to an increased or decreased excitability, the tinnitus pitch or loudness can momentarily rise or fall. And the reason why it's not permanent is because this temporary tension is obviously not permanent. And as we all know, permanent tension is not good and can lead to permanent tinnitus worsening or spiking, or lead to tinnitus not being able to decrease naturally, which is actually also known as homeostatic plasticity. I'm going to interject here and actually kind of say a theory that me and the community actually have as to why cochlear implants can actually cause or indirectly cause tinnitus suppression. It could potentially be the same thing, not exactly the same thing, but close enough to what is going on with somatosensory modulation, actually, except instead of going through the somatosensory pathway, these signals are being scrambled or disrupted. The hyperactive signals are being scrambled through the auditory nerve fibers indirectly towards the cartwheel cells. So when a person has his cochlear implant turned on, it's basically doing the same thing as a somatosensory modulation, actually, which decreases tinnitus, is potentially doing on these inhibitory intraneurons, which are the cartwheel cells. And this is why during our experimentation of the community, we came to a conclusion that the sensory nerves that are highlighted right here, ergo the buccal nerve, and also the greater auricular or the lesser occipital nerve that usually goes up behind the ear, greater auricular is usually right here, while placing electrodes on the sensory neurons, the sensory nerves of the buccal nerve specifically, which is right here, and placing one on the greater auricular nerve, which is right here, could potentially increase the efficacy due to the postsynaptic spikes being more intense than the presynaptic ones. But that's just a theory, and we really should do more research to confirm it. But for now, as you can see, the greater auricular nerve projects directly into the spinal trigeminal nucleus, and that's why I think that these sensory nerves, because they're the ones that input into the dorsal cochlear nucleus in the end, are so important to target. Now, something that has actually been confusing people a lot recently is the signal timing and the relative stimulation of the neurons. Now, a lot of people think that, and by the way, watch this in the Susan Shore webinar that is on my channel. A lot of people think that because the auditory stimulation comes first and then the somatosensory stimulation comes later, a lot of people think that this means that the auditory stimulation is the presynaptic spike and the somatosensory stimulation is the postsynaptic spike. But that is actually not true. It is the other way around, regardless of how counterintuitive it might seem. By the principles of spike timing dependent plasticity, the order in which the neurons fire dictates whether the synapse gets stronger or weaker. Now, as I have on my crudely drawn drawings right here, I have the postsynaptic neuron and I have the presynaptic neuron. Now, these neurons are connected at the synapses, and basically what that means is that the neural pathway is biased towards a certain direction. So it's not like a two-way street exactly, but this does not mean that the postsynaptic neuron cannot communicate with the presynaptic neuron. So when the postsynaptic neuron, or the neuron that comes after or comes later in the directional flow of the nerve signals, if it spikes first, this is not the natural order of things. So if the postsynaptic neuron spikes first, this sends a signal through retrograde signaling, basically communicates, the postsynaptic neuron does communicate with the presynaptic neuron regardless, even if the nerve signal is biased towards one direction. The postsynaptic neuron spiking first basically indicates that this neural connection right here is not important, because this is not usually what is supposed to happen. Usually it's supposed to be this one spikes, and then this one spikes, and the next one spikes in one direction. But if it happens the other way around, the body basically is send a signal through calcium signaling that this connection is not important because this is not supposed to usually happen. To get even deeper into it, when the auditory stimulation via the auditory nerve fibers happens, it primes the fusiform cells by bringing it closer to its threshold, basically causing eventually the spike or the action potential to occur in the fusiform cells. Now, this priming is very important because when we're talking about neural connections, they're very complex. And to put it simply, how is the body supposed to know which synaptic connection to degrade if there are no spikes? So that's why the fusiform cell has to be spiked first to make sure that the synaptic connections through the parallel fibers of the granule cells are the ones that are being targeted for long-term depression. Now, when the auditory nerve fiber spikes the fusiform cells, or causes them to spike, this then means that delivering the somatosensory stimulation shortly after, and keep in mind, I mentioned this before, because the directional output of the somatosensory pathway is generally one directional, so the somatosensory signals are being passed in to the dorsal cochlear nucleus, not the other way around. It's not like that. Because these signals are generally one directional, and that does not exclude retrograde signaling, by the way. It's just how the somatosensory pathway inputs into the dorsal cochlear nucleus. Because of this, the fusiform cells are primed, and that means when the somatosensory stimulation is being delivered to the spinal trigeminal nucleus, what it actually means is that the spinal trigeminal nucleus technically is the presynaptic spike, even though the stimulation comes afterwards, or after the audio stimulation. To explain it more simply, the stimulation of the device targets these nerves, either the sensory nerves or the sensory nerves of the trigeminal ganglion right here, or the sensory nerves of the cervical region right here. And then these signals are passed into the dorsal cochlear nucleus, but because they are organized in such a way that kind of makes the signal one directional, technically it means that these signals, the stimulation is actually presynaptic. Because if we take a look at the synapses right here that are on the parallel fibers, the axons from the granule cells, and the axons, by the way, of nerve cells, they pass the signal to the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. Because these signals are generally one directional, it means that if we take a look at this synapse right here, the signals that are coming in are actually presynaptic because of the direction of these neural pathways, if you understand me. Basically, a summary for the video. Somatosensory irritation is much more significant than you expect. And if you have a tense cervical area or a neck or a tense jaw, it could actually negate the effects of the Susan Shore device. Visiting a physical therapist, a competent physical therapist to look at your scans, not somebody who just massages you, is very important. Avoid chiropractors and avoid osteopaths generally. A very, very careful multimodal treatment approach is necessary for increasing the efficacy of the long-term depression. Because any of these irritants, noise, somatosensory irritants, disbalancing the neurotransmitters, all of it can actually negate the effects of the long-term depression. And as we all know, for the effects to be permanent, the AMPA receptors that receive the excitatory neurotransmitters need to be dissolved permanently. And what that means is sticking to a very strict, extremely strict protocol to make sure that the AMPA receptors do not pop back out onto the cell membrane, potentially negating the effects of long-term depression. If anybody has any more questions, they can join my Discord server, which will be linked in the description, or my subreddit. And that's about it for today. See ya.